Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Hi. My name is David Schaefer, Managing Director of the Maltz Museum. Thank you for joining us for this momentous occasion as we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with the book launch of Dancing in the Darkness, authored by Cleveland-born and nationally recognized Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III. I want to thank Maltz Museum co-founders Milton and Tamar Maltz, whose passion and vision enables us to host public programs like this one, in collaboration with special exhibitions like the one on view at the museum right now. We invite you to join us for the extraordinary special exhibition, This Light of Ours, Activist Photographers of the Civil Rights Movement, where you will step into the Deep South during the mid-1960s, explore how ordinary citizens risked everything for civil rights and the right to vote through the lens of 150 black and white images taken by 9 activist photographers. The exhibition is dedicated to a very special person, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr., who was there fighting for equality alongside his longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We are eternally grateful for his wisdom and guidance as Maltz Museum founding board member, internationally celebrated civil rights activist, and perhaps the most important title of all, father of today's speaker. Although he could not be with us today due to travel, we can still celebrate his life and legacy. How, you might ask? This year, the Maltz Museum unveiled our newest addition to our permanent collection, an interactive biography of Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr., filmed using state-of-the-art artificial intelligence technology. Reverend Moss can share his story and answer your questions, mimicking a real conversation, even though he's not with us in person. Now, tens of thousands of students and adults who pass through our doors each year will be able to hear the story of the civil rights movement directly from a primary source long after we're all gone. We were lucky to be present when Reverend Moss and his wife Edwina stopped by to see the technology come to life on our stage for the very first time. Let's take a look.
We are here at the Maltz Museum, where the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr. and his wife Edwina are about to see new technology that has turned Reverend Moss into an interactive biography so that visitors will be able to talk with him long into the future.
Oh, hello there.
Using state-of-the-art technology, Reverend Moss was filmed over the course of several days, answering thousands of questions about his life growing up in Georgia, being orphaned at 16, and continuing on to earn a Master's of Divinity from Morehouse College to become one of the foremost thought leaders on civil rights.
What's your story?
I am Otis Moss Jr., an eternal fighter for justice, human rights, civil rights, and the right to be a human being.
In 1961, Reverend Moss moved to Ohio to pastor Mount Zion Baptist Church. While at the church, he was regional director of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference and was side by side with Dr. King during the Civil Rights March in Selma, Alabama. The two became close friends.
Could you talk about your experiences with racism growing up in the South?
As I grew up, what was then known as the Deep South, Georgia, in the rural area, every moment, every day, the horrors of racism stood before you, beside you, in front of you, and behind you. going to school. We walked to school. In the sunshine, in the rain, in the mud. But white children rode to school, basking on warm, comfortable buses. And sometimes the bus driver intentionally ran us off the road. So every day we were aware of the racism and the dangers. And in spite of that, we determined not only to rise above it, but in some way, someday, to fight against it. And that fight continues to this very hour.
In 1975, Reverend Moss chose to make Cleveland his home and spent the next 33 years of his career as pastor of Olivet Baptist Church. A sought-after theologian, author, and speaker, he has lectured nationally and internationally at hundreds of prestigious institutions, traveling to Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Through artificial intelligence, Reverend Moss can now share his personal and powerful stories with generations to come.
If I had a few words to give in a story file to children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, I love you eternally. Always remember that.
I need to confess to everyone here, sometime I sneak into the auditorium and I turn on the interactive. And so the secret's out. I do it to learn, to be inspired, and just to spend some time with Reverend Moss. So I invite everyone here in the coming months and years to come to the museum and learn and speak with Reverend Moss. So thank you, Reverend Moss, and thank you to all the dedicated board, staff, volunteers, and members who enable us to share stories of courage and strength. Your continued commitment to our mission is greatly appreciated. And thank you to today's sponsor, the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, Community Relations Committee, and to all of our community partners. We are stronger when we work together. Thank you for all the work you do and your continued support. Together, we represent many different faiths, backgrounds, and cultures with a shared belief that understanding history matters. When we study history, we understand our present and imagine how to create a better future. So at this time, I'd like to ask and welcome to the podium for a message of unity, Rabbi Jonathan Cohen.
Friends, at this time in our calendar, we study the second Torah portion of the book of Exodus. And it is around this time in our biblical story that a new leader, Moses, is called upon to go out to Pharaoh and to demand the liberty, the dignity, the rights of his people, of all peoples. And it is at this time that Moses encounters rejection, negation, and disregard, even in the face of initial consequences. It is with regard to this Torah portion that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. wrote the following words: "Is anything more obvious than the presence of evil in the universe? Its nagging, prehensible tentacles project into every level of human existence. We may debate the origin of evil, but only a victim of superficial optimism would debate its reality. Evil is stark, grim, and colossally real." King continues, "Within the wide arena of everyday life, we see evil in all of its ugly dimensions." This was written in 1963. "We see it expressed in tragic lust and inordinate selfishness. We see it in high places where people are willing to sacrifice truth on the altars of their self-interest. That surely is no longer relevant. We see it in imperialistic nations crushing other people with the battering rams of social injustice. We see it clothed in the garments of calamitous wars that leave people and nations morally and physically bankrupt. A graphic example of this truth is found in the early history of the Hebrew people. When the children of Israel were held under the gripping yoke of Egyptian slavery, Egypt symbolized evil in the form of humiliating oppression, ungodly exploitation, and crushing domination. And the Israelites symbolized goodness in the form of devotion and dedication to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Egypt struggled to maintain her oppressive yoke, and Israel struggled to gain freedom. Pharaoh stubbornly refused to respond to the cry of Moses, even when plague after plague threatened his domain. This tells us something about evil that we must never forget. Namely, that evil is recalcitrant and determined and never voluntarily relinquishes its hold short of a persistent, almost fanatical resistance. It is in the face of this kind of evil that the prophet Ezekiel prophesies to Israel, and especially to Israel yet again under the yoke of a dominant Egypt. And so in chapter 29 of the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel speaks of a redemption to come and says, Bayom hahu atzmiach keren leveit Yisrael. When redemption will come, I will make grow a ray of light for the people, the house of Israel. Ulecha eten pithon pe betocham. And to you, the prophet, the messenger of light, of goodness, of hope, I will allow the opening of your mouth in their midst, that they may hear you. Veyid'u ki ani Adonai, and they shall know together, collectively, in community, that I am the sovereign God. And so, at this moment, let us pray. Let us pray that we may experience, that we may see, that we may witness that ray of light, of goodness, of hope, that glimmer of redemption in our lifetimes. That we may turn our ears, our minds, our hearts to the voices of the prophet, the voices of those who speak of redemption, of unity, of community, of joint purpose and mission. And that we may come to know in our day together the unity of humankind and the sovereignty of our God. And let us together say, Amen. Amen. And now, it gives me great pleasure to invite and to welcome to this podium the chair of the Jewish Federation of Cleveland's Community Relations Council, Susan Borison.
Thank you, Rabbi Cohen. Your words are particularly inspiring for this meaningful day. Just as a separate note, if everybody could look at their phones and make sure they are off. Thank you. It is now my honor to introduce Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III. He last impressed us with his words and wisdom on this very stage during the launch of the Civil Rights Movement exhibition, This Light of Ours. As David mentioned, the special exhibition is now on view at the Maltz Museum. Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, with his father, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr., joined us for a screening of Otis's Dream, a film that he wrote telling the powerful and poignant story of his grandfather, Otis Moss Sr. The 15-minute film focuses on his determination to exercise his right to vote in 1946. 1946 in Georgia, when a black man's attempt to vote could cost him his life. Reverend Dr. Moss is from Cleveland, Ohio. Yeah. His next stop was Morehouse College, where he graduated with honors. From Atlanta to New Haven, Connecticut, Dr. Moss added a Master of Divinity from Yale Divinity School. Then he earned a Doctor of Ministry from Chicago Theological Seminary. Reverend Dr. Moss returned to Yale in 2014 to present the famed Lyman Beecher Lectures, one of the most distinguished lecture series on preaching in the world. His lectures were the foundation of his last book, Blue Note Preaching in a Post-Soul World, Finding Hope in an Age of Despair. Reverend Dr. Moss, senior pastor at the Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, has built his ministry on community advancement and social justice activism. He has spent the last 2 decades practicing and preaching a Black theology that unapologetically calls attention to the problems of mass incarceration, environmental injustice, and economic inequality. As part of his community engagement through his church, Reverend Dr. Moss led a team that came up with a curriculum called My Life Matters. Included in the curriculum is the video, Get Home Safely, 10 Rules of Survival. This powerful 2-minute video was created in the aftermath of Michael Brown's death by police officers in Ferguson, Missouri. And really, everyone check out that video. In 2009, Dr. Moss was named the inaugural class of the Route 100, a list that recognizes emerging and established African American leaders who are making extraordinary contributions. In 2018, Dr. Moss was recognized by Baylor University's Truett Seminary as one of the 12 most effective preachers in the English-speaking world. With a unique gift to communicate across generations, Dr. Moss is a popular speaker on college campuses, at conferences, and churches across the globe. He is highly influenced by the work and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the pastoral ministry of his father, Reverend Dr. Moss Jr. Today, we celebrate the launch of Reverend Dr. Moss's newest book, Dancing in the Darkness, Spiritual Narratives for Thriving in a Turbulent Time. After Reverend Dr. Moss reads from his book, we will have time for audience Q&A, so get your questions ready. Following the Q&A, Reverend Dr. Moss will head over to the Maltz Museum next door for book signing, and there will be books to purchase. Now, please help me welcome the Maltz Museum's Martin Luther King Day keynote speaker, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III.
I want to take this moment to say thank you. Thank you to the Maltz Museum community for the work that you are doing not only here in Cleveland, but across the nation and across the globe. In the West African tradition, there is an individual known as the griot. The griot is the person who is the storyteller, who holds the traditions and the values of a community. That in order for generations that are not yet born may understand not only that history is sacred, but there is a spiritual sacred thread that runs through all of our lives. The Maltz Museum has been a griot, ensuring that we not only understand our history, but raising the spiritual questions of human flourishing and resilience. And so I, on behalf of my family, want to say thank you. It was a blessing to walk into the Maltz Museum and see an AI version of my dad. I said, "What's up, Dad?" He said, "Hello." And so I want to say thank you for thinking of not only my father, but also my mother. As you know, the two of them, they met during the freedom struggle. My father was a lieutenant in SCLC, but many may not know that my mother was the office manager for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, my mother did not go on marches. Reason being is because she was very clear that she was still working through the ideas of nonviolence. She said, "I'm not quite sure if someone says or throws something at me, what my reaction will be." But nonetheless, they met in that movement, and on behalf of myself, my brother Kevin, and my sister Daphne, who now rests with our ancestors, we are grateful for two amazing human beings who are our parents. And Mom, I thank you, and we love you, and we are grateful to you. Also, on behalf of my family, Monica is unable to be with us at this time. She was hoping to be with us, but we have had a whirlwind of a week. Several things happened. One, our daughter, Michaela, just started at a new school. She transferred from Claflin College and is now at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. We had to move her in these past few days. We're getting her settled. And then our son, Elijah, just arrived back from a study abroad in Ireland. And so they have been busy running around and needing money from their parents and whatnot. So please, I want to thank Monica. She has been going back and forth. She was in Macon. She had to make her way to Richmond as her beloved Aunt Phyllis, who was on a ventilator. They had taken her off of this ventilator, and I would ask that you would just continue to pray with her family. Otherwise, she would have been with us on this day. And I'm just grateful that there are so many people from the village of Olivet Institutional Baptist Church. I would not be who I am if it had not been for the village of Olivet. And to my crew from Shaker Heights High School, we have been down with each other since kindergarten. And I'm just so grateful for my friends who are truly my sisters and brothers who have shown up here today. I'm just eternally grateful for this honor and this opportunity. What I'd like to do for the next few moments that we have together, and I also want to thank David Schaefer and Rabbi Cohen and Sister Susan and Dahlia. And I want to say this about Rabbi Cohen. So Rabbi Cohen, I need you. I love your voice, man. I love your voice. So I need you and my father to just like record reading scripture. That's all I need you all to do, okay? I need some Torah reading and some gospel reading, and then both of you all just share the prophets together. That's all we need, and that will be a blessing. We'll just call it scripture in your ear. That's all we'll do it. And we will call Audible and ask them to record both of you all, and it would be a blessing. So the Spirit just dropped that in. So Brother David, if you all want to work out a thing just to have the two of them reading scripture, I think it would be, people across the globe will just be blessed by that. But for the next few moments, I would like to do something. And as we come together on this day, as we typically in this nation celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but I want to frame it from a different perspective, borrowing from the text, Dancing in the Darkness, to look at this idea of how do we as a nation dance in this civic darkness? What do we do collectively? And as we gather, and people are gathering across the nation to lift up Dr. King, but I'm reminded of a poet by the name of Wendell Holmes. He was quoted first by Dr. Vincent Harding, who was a good friend of Dr. King and actually edited that Riverside speech where he came out against the war in Vietnam in a powerful way. And it was Wendell Holmes who wrote a poem in 1969, I believe, that goes this way, speaking about how America deals with Dr. King. Now that he is safely dead, let us praise him and build monuments to his name. Sing hosannas to his name and glory. Dead men make such convenient heroes. They cannot rise to challenge the images we would fashion from their lives. And it's easier to build monuments than to build a better world. So now that he is safely dead, let us freeze him in 1963, simply uttering the words of, "I have a dream that will remain a dream, as Wendell Holmes states, a dead man's dream. So the question as we lift up the legacy of Dr. King, that we must realize that it was not just Dr. King working alone, nor do we want to frame Dr. King in such a way where everybody seems to love Dr. King now that he's dead. It was J. Edgar Hoover who stated that he was the most dangerous man in America. And before his assassination, they had a poll that in the state of Georgia, he was the most hated man in his home state of Georgia. And we have moved from this radical king to where it seems that everybody loves Dr. King. And they have smoothed out all of the radical edges and sold a phrase of "I have a dream," not realizing the radical nature of in 63, when he stood before America, he offered an idea saying that Black Americans had been given a check, that every time we go to cash it, it is marked insufficient funds. He stood before the nation demanding not only the right to vote, but speaking about the scourge of poverty and also militarism. That we were more concerned about building budgets to destroy than to elevate the education of the poorest of the poor in our nation. So how do we dance in this darkness? To know that Dr. King does not come out of nowhere. He didn't just drop down out of history with no connections whatsoever. There was a village around him, a village what I would call resilience, that helped nurture his spirituality and his theology. This village of resilience, the way that Howard Thurman would put it, that there was always someone who made a way for someone else. And one must understand the connections for us to understand the complexity of who Dr. King was and what he means for us today. This idea of village of resilience. I'm reminded of a writer by the name of Alice Schreiner, who was beloved by another writer I love by the name of Howard Thurman. Alice Schreiner was a feminist in South Africa before the term feminism had actually been created. And there she wrote a book entitled The Story of an African Farm, and often would write these essays speaking about you can get a glimpse of that which is sacred if you stare long enough at creation. And as she was a small child, she speaks of the idea of looking at a creek and noticing that there were some locusts that came to the creek. One locust and then another and then another, and then eventually they built a bridge that allowed the entire hive of locusts to go to the other side. She raised the question about how is it, what happened to those that made a track to the river's edge and were washed away by history. And she writes to say that for those of us who are on the other side of the water, that we must know that there was always somebody who made a track to the river's edge. They didn't make it to the other side, but if they had not made those tracks, we would not be on the other side of the river today. And I raise the question that though we lift up Dr. King this day, that there are those who made a track to the river's edge for Dr. King. There's a name that many may not know, but who also made those tracks to the river's edge, a person by the name of Reverend Vernon Johns. Reverend Johns, who was born in Lynchburg, Virginia. And as a small child, he only went to school about 3 months out of the year, because the rest of the time he had to be out in the field, because they figured that people who'd been kissed by nature's sun deserve to be working with their hands in the field and do not deserve to be in schools to elevate their mind and their spirit. But there was something in Vernon Johns. He believed that he was not called nor ordained to be a sharecropper. He had read somewhere about a school up here in Ohio named Oberlin University. And he decided that he was going to make his way to Oberlin. So he applied to Oberlin. And Chris, it's a fascinating story because when he applied to Oberlin and mailed out his application, he calculated how many days it would take for the application to arrive on the desk at the dean at Oberlin. So he said he was going to arrive at school on the day of his application. Because if they were going to deny him, they were going to have to deny him to his face. So he gathered all of his clothes, got onto a train and made his way up to Oberlin, Ohio. Showed up at the dean's office and said, "My name is Vernon Johns and I'm reporting here for school my first year." The dean, looking at this person that had been kissed by nature's son, was quite confused. He was looking around his desk and said, son, I'm trying to figure out. I don't have your application. And then he found on his desk, among papers that had just arrived from the mail, that he had his application. He opened up his application, looked at it for a moment, and then said, "Boy, it seems here that you don't have enough credits to enter into Oberlin." And Vernon Johns, without missing a beat, said, "Do you want brains or do you want credits? I got the brains, I may not have the credits." The dean was a little bit annoyed and said to him, "Well, in order to be a part of this school, you have to be able to read Greek fluently." And Vernon Johns scanned the bookshelf of the dean and said, "Is that a Greek book behind you? May I see it?" And then began to read fluently. And he said again, "Do you want brains or do you want credits?" And the dean was upset and said, "Well, that's nice. That was a nice little move there, but you got to be able to read Hebrew fluently." He said, "Isn't that a Hebrew book to the right on your shelf?" Took it and read it fluently. They entered him into the class provisionally, and then he graduated second in his class. And then eventually was called to a small church down in Montgomery, Alabama, known as Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And there at Dexter Avenue, because Vernon Johns was such a radical person, here are some of the actual messages he preached. One was entitled, "Is Heaven Segregated?" And another, and he put out on the front of the church that next Sunday he was going to be preaching, "Is it legal to lynch Negroes in Alabama?" This was all in the 1930s. Now, the sheriff was driving by when he saw what Vernon Johns was going to preach, and they arrested him for what he was going to preach. You got to be a bad brother to be arrested for what you haven't preached yet. So they show up, they arrest him, they take him down to the jail. And there he is, surrounded by officers, Southern officers from Montgomery, Alabama. And they say, "Vernon, you need to tell us what you gonna preach this coming Sunday. This Negroes being lynched in Alabama." And Vernon Johns, looking at all the officers who had guns on their hips, he then thought very quickly and took off his hat. He said, "I'd be more than happy to tell you, but I have to tell you, I'm a Baptist preacher." And therefore, he took his hat off. He said, "Before I can preach, I got to take an offering." And at that moment, they started laughing and they let him go. So for several years, he kept preaching, talking about the challenges in Alabama. And the deacon board got together and said, "We got to get rid of this brother." And they put him out of the church. Then they organized and said, "We need to call somebody we can control. Somebody young, we can tell them what to do." And then one of the deacons raised their hand and said, I know of a young man who just got his PhD in Boston by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., and he becomes the next pastor of Dexter Avenue, and the rest is history. A village of resilience. There would be no Dr. King if there had not been a Vernon Johns. But many of you think about the bus boycott in Montgomery, and we always have an image that it was only Dr. King. But let me give you the truth of the village of resilience during that time period. Dr. King, only 26 years old, Nick, at the time, that he was in a meeting in the basement after this wonderful sage had been arrested in Montgomery. She was a part of the NAACP, had been a fighter of justice, a woman by the name of Rosa Parks. And the ministers in Montgomery had made the decision that we have to do something, but they weren't quite sure what they should do. There was one group that said, we just need to turn it over to the NAACP, let the Legal Defense Fund deal with this. Then another group said, no, we need to have a boycott for 2 or 3 days so we can negotiate with the city. And as the men were arguing, there was a group of sisters in the meeting. That group was run and organized by a woman by the name of Joanne Robinson. She was head of the Women's Political Council, had been fighting for the rights of those who've been marginalized in America for quite some time. And back in the room with Rosa Parks and Joanne Robinson, they were listening to all the brothers arguing, and Joanne Robinson told the sisters, come on, let's get out of this room. We got to leave. The brothers will be here arguing all night. We're going to go over to Alabama State, where she was a professor, and we're going to go ahead and start the boycott. So they went over to Alabama State, and they decided to create flyers on a mimeograph machine. Now, for those of you who've never heard of a mimeograph machine, that was before a copy machine. You had to crank the thing to roll it out. And they printed 55,000 flyers in 8 hours. That by the time the sun came up, they used young black paper boys to deliver every flyer to every black household in Montgomery. So by the time that Dr. King woke up, got his coffee and his paper, he looked and saw that there was a flyer. He said, I guess I'm a part of a boycott now. But because of the organizing power of women that we do not lift up from this village of resilience, Joanne Robinson, with her incredible power. And if we as a nation are going to transform this particular democracy, we need the griots who understand the stories, and we must create a village of resilience to raise a generation that has moral imagination. Moral imagination, what is this idea? Moral imagination simply means that I can see a future, though it is not, I will act as if it is. A moral imagination raises questions for the least of these. A moral imagination is what Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel were attempting to do. They were speaking into the hearts and lives of those who had gone astray. One of my favorite stories of moral imagination. I absolutely love this brother, and many people have never heard of him. It's a gentleman by the name of Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls, who was born in Beaufort, South Carolina, as an enslaved African. But in his spirit, in his mind, along with his wife, once his child was born, Sabrina, Robert Jr., they made a decision that we will not allow our child to grow up as chattel. And so we are going to escape to freedom. But this is in Beaufort. They had been moved to Charleston, where they were serving. They were enslaved. And they hatched a plan, along with 11 other enslaved Africans, that they would go toward their freedom. They were not going to run toward their freedom. They were not going to ride toward their freedom. They were going to steal a Confederate warship and sail to their freedom. This thing is better than Oceans 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I'm telling you, they stole a Confederate warship because Robert Smalls and several other Africans were working and cleaning on Confederate warships. And the strange thing about racism and white supremacy is it's arrogant and ignorant at the same time. And so it was Robert Smalls, along with these several other Africans, enslaved Africans, who were called to clean the ship and repair the ship and even drive the ship, but they couldn't be captains of the ship. And so what they did is they memorized everything about that ship. And there were two Confederate officers that they knew every night around 8 p.m. got drunk and went to a house of ill repute. They did it every night. And so they decided that on one particular night, when they got drunk and went to the red light district, that they would then bring their families on board the ship. They had memorized every Confederate code. And so as they began to sail the ship, in order to get out of the Charleston harbor, you first had to know the necessary codes to be able to share to the harbor master. Robert Smalls put on Confederate clothes. The sun was not yet up, so there was only a silhouette of this man who was an enslaved African acting like a Confederate soldier. He stood on the bow of the ship, and when they got to the harbor master, he did his thing doing this, and the harbor master said, "Go on with your bad self." And they started sailing to freedom. But you must understand the history. It was the Union forces that had ongoing orders that any ship that comes out of the Charleston harbor that has not surrendered, you are to fire on it immediately. And as they were sailing out, they had not yet reached freedom. And they were trying to think what to do when they saw at a distance that there was a Union ship that had its guns trained upon them. And it was Sister Smalls, Robert Smalls' wife, who said, "Find a white sheet and run it up the pole and let them know that we have surrendered." They found a white sheet. They ran it up the pole, Kyle, but something else happened. A fog came into the harbor. No one could see the white flag of surrender. And so the Union ship trained its guns upon Robert Smalls' ship at that time and began to count. They said 1, they said 2, and as if on cue by Steven Spielberg or something, all of a sudden the sun came out and burned off all of the fog. They saw the white flag, and then they said, "Halt!" And they boarded the ship. And here are these Union soldiers. They keep running around the ship looking for somebody white. They couldn't find anybody white on the ship. And Robert Smalls says, "I, Robert Smalls, give this ship to Abraham Lincoln for freedom. And all of the cargo here, we are human beings and we seek to be free." It would seem that that would be an amazing story in of itself. But it doesn't stop there. He gives a Confederate warship and the Confederate codes to the Union Army. Then becomes the first officer in the armed forces in the United States of America. Fights for the Union. But it doesn't stop there. The brother believed in equality of education, and he had several daughters. He made sure that his daughters went to Oberlin and University of Pennsylvania and went to France to study along with his son. But he couldn't stay in Philadelphia. Said he had to go back south to help those who were struggling because they had the weight of what was known as the Confederate ghost of white supremacy upon their back. And so he goes back to South Carolina, where he had been born, goes back to Beaufort, South Carolina, where he was enslaved, and he buys the house and plantation where he was a slave, and then allows the mistress to live on the property, not in the big house, small house out back, by the way. He then starts 4 schools for formerly enslaved Africans, private schools. But he said this is not enough. He becomes one of the wealthiest person in South Carolina, but then he decides to run for Congress and he wins. While he is in Congress, he lays the foundation of a policy that we still embrace this day. He sets the foundation of what we now know as early childhood development and education, better known as the public school system. So the next time you walk through the doors of a public school, say, "Thank you, Robert. We appreciate you." Utilizing one's moral imagination. And in this country, we are lacking the idea of teaching moral imagination to the next generation. We cannot turn over the imagination to corporations. We cannot turn over imagination to Silicon Valley. And we certainly cannot turn over our imagination to those who think they're controlling Congress. We cannot turn our imagination over to those. We must recognize that there is power when there is a village of resilience and we are willing to utilize our moral imagination. If I may share a story of the power of utilizing your imagination, what can happen in moments when you are open to the possibility of the Spirit. As I remember in 2008, when there was a gentleman in our congregation at Trinity United Church of Christ who was running for president, a senator by the name of Barack Obama, who eventually became president and now is in retirement as president. But he was running for president in that moment. There's something happened in our church. I remember I was at, I believe it was, at the time it was called Bally's Fitness. I was on a treadmill and someone tapped me on the shoulder. I was doing my warm down, Ed, and someone said, "Is that your church on the news?" And I looked up and I saw Sean Hannity just going off. And I said, "Well, I guess I got to leave right now." And at that moment, over 40 outlets were showing up every Sunday because they took a piece of my predecessor's message out of context and blasted it all over conservative radio and television. 40 outlets every Sunday. But then the death threats began. That we had letters that we would receive every day from my predecessor, Dr. Jeremiah Wright Jr., and myself, and the church. We had to have bomb-sniffing dogs show up every time we had any type of event. We had to hire new security. I had my own personal security that had to follow me everywhere. Got on my nerves everywhere I went. I was like, "Can I go in here by myself?" Nope. I was like, "Okay, I've got to go wherever you go." So the security was with us consistently, and it does something to your spirit when you're consistently looking over your shoulder, wondering if this person walking up to you is friend or foe. And one night, I was trying to sleep, and that is the operative word, trying, because I did not get much sleep during that time period, maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours. And we heard something in the house, and Monica tapped me on my shoulder and said, "You need to go check that out." And I grabbed my rod and my staff that comforts me. It's from Louisville. It's a Louisville Slugger. So there I was walking around the house, trying to figure out what this noise was. Also wondering, is this the moment? Is this it? After all of the letters, all of the emails, all of the people who had been showing up, was this the moment that someone, some crazed individual who had been listening to conservative radio, made the decision that they were going to take out an individual? And so I looked around the house. I heard the noise again, the noise coming from my daughter's bedroom. And then I go into my daughter's bedroom, and there is my baby girl, all of 5 years old. She is in the middle of her room, and she's spinning and dancing. She says, "Look, Daddy, I'm dancing." Pigtails just spinning back and forth. And I say in my fatherly voice, because I had to preach in several hours, it was 3 a.m. I said, "Baby, you need to go to bed." But she kept saying, "Look, Daddy, I'm dancing." And then at that moment, the Spirit said, "Stop and listen. Look at your daughter. Your daughter is dancing in the darkness. The darkness is around her, but the darkness is not in her." And in that moment, I scrapped my sermon for Sunday, ran down to the study, and then began to write what was moving in my spirit. And when I stood into the pulpit on that day, I stood before the congregation and told them that we are called to dance in the darkness. Just like little Michaela, the darkness may be around us, but it is not in us. And if we are to see transformation in this fragile democracy, we must dance. Dance with love plus justice. Dance with compassion and joy. Dance with forgiveness and grace and mercy. And if by chance we learn how to dance, we will see transformation in this democracy we call the yet-to-be United States of America. Let us learn how to dance in the darkness. What I wanted them to know, and what I want you to know this moment, when the darkness shows up, it does not mean the sun has forsaken us. It just means that the earth has turned. But if the earth keeps turning, the sun shall rise again. So dance, as the psalmist says, will turn your mourning into dancing. Dance, and eventually joy will come in the morning. And if America chooses to dance, if we choose to build a democracy in these yet to be United States of America, something will happen. There will be a transformation when we merge love and justice together. Not love simply, not justice by itself, for love without justice is simply sentimentality. And justice without love can become brutality and legalism. But when love and justice get married, they walk down the aisle and are betrothed together and eventually will have children, one by the name of transformation, the other by the name of liberation. If we are willing to merge these values together, and we will see something unique in these United States, these yet to be United States of America. Whether you are black or white, whether you are Jew or Gentile, whether you are atheist or Anglican, whether you're a Buddhist or Baptist, Muslim or Methodist, queer or Quaker, bougie or broke, urban or suburban, redneck or trap city, Pentecostal or Presbyterian, Hindu or holiness, Sikh or sanctified, whether you graduated magna cum laude or just thank you, Lord. Something will happen when we come together and merge these values. And if we merge these values together, we will be able to sing like the bard of South Central LA by the name of Kendrick Lamar. We can say together, we gonna be all right. We gonna be all right. God bless you, God keep you, and let us dance in the dark. Thank you very much. I want to move to Sister Dahlia. She told me that we're going to do Q&A at this moment for a little time. And so if you have a question, Sister Dahlia will assist you. She has the microphone.
Hi.
And you can just raise your hand and Dahlia will make her way to you. Uh-oh. This is my sister, by the way. That's Sabrina. We've known each other since middle school.
I don't have a serious question. So with such a diverse group here in age and religion and race and what have you, one of the things we used to talk about when we were young was the importance of when we were going to be able to vote. So what do I say to someone who is 15, 14 and a half, and is about to be, old enough to vote? How do I convince them that their vote makes a difference and that it is something that you have to do, whether it's president or dog catcher?
That's a great question, Sabrina. We have a program that we participate in Chicago, entitled Freedom School. And the Freedom School program works with young people, one, around literacy, and two, about civic responsibility. And what we do is we walk through it, we say to the young people, we say, would you like to see a change on your block? And they all say, yes. I said, what are the changes that you want to make on your block? And one young person said, I want to see him pick up the trash. I'm tired of this. I said, then that is the responsibility of your alderman. If you give the responsibility to someone else that's not a part of your community, they don't care if there's trash on your block. But because you are a part of this community, your vote has the ability to elect someone who is concerned about your block. Then we expand it. Now, we go from your block to your neighborhood. So let's talk about how you want to change your neighborhood. What is it that you want to see? Well, there's violence in my neighborhood. Very good. What would you like to see? You want to see more police? No, they're a problem. I want to see more interrupters, violence interrupters who are on the street, who are working with young people. I said, guess what? The county commissioner is the one who funds the violence interrupters. So now, if you want to get the trash off your street, you want the violence interrupters, it is then connected to your vote. So we continue to move till we get to county. Then we go to state. Then we go nationwide. Our problem is we're always going presidential instead of going local. Go local first. Teach people how to change things locally. I'll give a great example of your niece, Michaela. Michaela said to the representative in our neighborhood, one of our street lights has been out for several weeks, Mr. O'Shea. Mr. O'Shea called downtown and said, we need to fix the street light. Michaela got an example of her civic responsibility by confronting the alderman in our neighborhood and got the street light fixed in the process. Again, it was an examination in reference to civics. We've got to go local and stop going national when people are trying to figure out, I don't know how that connects with me. But everybody wants the street lights on and want the trash removed. You want a safe community. You want good schools. We start there, and our local representatives are the people that we have to hold accountable.
Yeah, my name is Richard Beck, and I'm a retired United Church of Christ minister from an hour
Wonderful,
south.
wonderful.
And I'm in the Sierra, and I have 6 grandsons, and I worry about their future. Do you have anything to say about the earth? You said something about creation and all that kind of thing, but to me it's really scary right now. We've just built in Ohio lots of new pipelines so that we can burn fossil fuel around the world with our God's natural gas that's here, and it seems to me we have to be going in a lot of different directions, probably including the way we eat. You want to take off from there?
Sure. I would put it this way, that the issue of creation care is an existential and spiritual issue for this moment. That if we do not have the wherewithal or the courage, the moral courage to connect the ideas, that we will not be able to continue to live if the planet is not able to thrive. So what do we do? Well, number one is that we organize, especially this younger generation, understanding not only the importance of creation, but also the problem, let me put it this way, the problem of capitalism co-opting creation. And that is what we're witnessing right now. We're witnessing so many corporations that are looking for short-term profit that in the long term will harm humanity. But hope is on the rise, because there is an entire generation globally that is moving on these issues. You may not be aware, but across the Sahara Desert, there are a group of young people who have been planting. They're trying to call them the trans-African, I'm trying to figure out the name that they call it, but essentially they want to be able to build trees from one side of Africa to the other. And they believe that by building this quote-unquote arboretum highway, that it will be a part of changing the way that not only we view creation, but will also change in reference to climate. Change is on the way. There is a whole group of wonderful activists who are concerned about the environment and connecting it to faith. Reverend Heber Brown out of Baltimore, who has organized hundreds of congregations in and around creation care and also about sustainability. Trinity United Church of Christ, that part of our value system is creation care, along with dismantling mass incarceration and empowering people economically and dealing with economic apartheid. The challenge that we have, the problem that we have, is that we allow other people to have the mic. One of my favorite hip hop artists is a brother by the name of Nas. He has a song called "One Mic Will Change the World." And we have to take hold of the mic and tell the story of what is really happening. Otherwise, we will find ourselves moving into a cynicism and pessimism of non-action. We have to tell the stories of what people are doing globally, what they're doing in Liberia and what they're doing in India. What's happening in Brazil is magnificent among indigenous people in terms of protecting the rainforest. What is going on in Nicaragua and what is happening in many states across the United States. Part of our problem is we allow other people to tell us what's happening. We have to find the stories and elevate those stories and see these transformative moments that are happening globally. And as I travel, I see an incredible generation rising. I was speaking with a group of evangelicals, and what I found is that younger evangelicals have real issue with their grandparents and parents. They said, y'all lied to us. I found out that God is concerned about poverty and creation and how we treat each other. You said God was only concerned about two things. That was about abortion and about same-gender loving relationships. We're getting rid of that. We're going to focus on the existential crisis. So now you have evangelicals between the ages of 18 and 25 who are now incredibly progressive in reference to the issues around creation, care, or environmentalism. But you will not, on any network, see it. But it's happening across the nation. We've got to tell the stories. And in the words of Nas, take the mic because one mic will change the world.
All right.
My name is Kevin Morris. Dr. Moss, I remember you from a teenager when you were talking about all church music. Actually, introduced you to some Duke Ellington, some Charlie Parker, and Count Basie, if you might remember. And also,
yes, sir.
Your dad and I both participated in the historic Selma March, and he and I often talk about when we met there in Montgomery. And the lights went out when Dr. King gave his famous "How Long, Not Long" speech. That famous march your dad and I both participated in. So I've always been proud of that. But my question is, John Lewis was always quoted as saying that without God, there would be no civil rights movement. And my question is, what is happening now with all religions where the participation is just dwindling, whether it be Baptist or Lutheran or Methodist or Judaism or Hinduism, or it seems like the young generations are not participating in religions. They just seem to be falling off. The participation in churches and synagogues and mosques, there's just a dwindling participation. Do you have any comment on why that is or what we can do about that? Because John Lewis said, without God, there would have been no civil rights movement. I'd like your read on that.
Certainly. I have a wonderful friend, Reverend Brianna, who works with doing research in and around this issue. The issue is that you have a generation that has issue with religion, but doesn't have an issue with God. It's two different things. They have an issue with the system, they have an issue with the framing, and they have an issue with that religious, or I like to say churchified folk, get so focused on the minors that they're not focused on the majors. So here's the interesting thing. This generation, whether you're talking about Z, whether you're talking about millennials, they have a deep sense of spirituality and faith. And they want to see their faith embodied. They want to practice their faith. They just don't want to shout their faith. And so whenever there are moments where they have an opportunity to practice their faith, they show up in droves. I'll give you a prime example. We turned our church into a homeless shelter when it was something like, it was like negative 40 something in Chicago. That was without wind chill. It was something crazy. It was before the pandemic. And when we decided to do that, we said, hey, we're going to house people who can't be housed. Millennials came out of the woodwork. Wow. I mean, they were they were everywhere. They were like, what can we do? How can? So we had literally we set up caravans of young people who were going out to McDonald's. They were going to what is called Lower Wacker in Chicago. It's like underneath these bridges to find people who needed to be housed. They were practicing their faith. That's what they want to do. They don't want to have conversations about what song are we going to sing. They don't want to have a conversation, should I wear this? They don't want to have conversation on colors on the pulpit and all of that. They don't want to have any of those conversations. They don't want to have conversations about issues that do not matter in their eyes. But soon as you, for example, have a conversation about justice, they'll show up. Because they will say, this is what democracy looks like, and this is what my faith looks like when you see me in the street. So that becomes the learning point that we must learn. So the civil rights movement was people practicing their faith. They were praying by marching, in the words of Abraham Heschel, with their feet. We have to learn that again, that the things that we have been concerned with and focused on, this generation doesn't have time nor tolerance for that. Thank you for that question.
Hello, and thank you so much. I just first want to say that I have heard about you, the legend, and coming here, I am just inspired, and I feel on fire. So thank you so much for your words. I am Natalie Whitlow. I'm a psychologist in the community, and I also have two children, a 9-year-old here, and I have a 21-year-old soon to be. And this concept of moral imagination, I love that term. You know, it reminds me of just the boldness and courage to dream and go and do those things that your heart and spirit drives you to do. Do you have any key pointers on, as a mother and a psychologist, how can I encourage moral imagination in my children and in the children that I service, and also help parents to be excited about encouraging that, because sometimes we can unknowingly squash it because we just want them to be children and behave. So do you have any pointers about how we can do that, encourage that in children? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I believe that the connection between service and I'm going to give you another piece. One of the wonderful, I didn't really realize this, but the pedagogy of Montessori school assists in the development of moral imagination because it allows young people to explore their gifts. Our current educational system is an industrial framing. It was designed specifically to allow people to go to work on an assembly line, put some rivets together. Here, rote memorization. I am a product, not only early on with Montessori, but because my parents, but there was a wonderful woman at Mercer Elementary School by the name of Miss Burns. Miss Burns was the reading teacher for those who supposedly had learning differences. They had a different name back then. And I was in the basement with about 10 other young people. And here comes Miss Burns. She walks in. We're in the basement of the school. Just think about it. We're going to say, you have learning differences. We're going to put you in the basement next to a boiler. All right? And then we want you to rise and do great things. So here comes Miss Burns. She walks in and she says to all of us, you do not belong here. My job is to let you know how gifted you are. And she began to tell us how gifted we are and would allow us to read what we wanted to read and focus on what we wanted to focus on because she wanted to nurture the idea of learning and ignite our imagination. We have to move back to that moment that if a young person, and you may not know anything about it, but if they're interested in something that you know nothing about, you need to go ahead and push them in that particular direction. if they are looking to read, for example, I like comics and whatnot, and my daughter likes comics. And so I would pass on comics and take them to Comic-Con when they were little to excite their imagination in the process. And we have to be willing to be nimble, to know that they're our teachers. They're the ones who are going to be teaching us in the process. And we have to put that back in our educational system. And so that would be kind of the main piece that I would say, just kind of nurturing that service and nurturing the things that they desire and they want to try. And it's okay if they try something and it doesn't work out. That's just one thing I love about the Black church. You know, the Black church can encourage you unlike any other place. Because I remember doing some of them Easter speeches, I messed up, and then they'd be like, baby, that was good. You did a great job. That was wonderful. It's so wonderful. And you just tore up everything, messed up everything. But you had a village of people who were creating resilience in you, celebrating even when you fall, and saying, woo, that baby knows how to fall, don't he? Woo, yeah. I mean, they find something to celebrate. And that's what we have to learn today for our children. We have to find ways to celebrate them. And when they're celebrated, they rise in the process, because who doesn't want to be celebrated? Who doesn't want to be affirmed? Thank you for that.
Yes, sir. My name is Michael, and I have the great honor of working for a wonderful person, Margaret Wong, who is an immigration attorney. I just wanted to ask you, just like you were saying with green energy, is sharing different narratives the answer to urging people to be more welcoming towards immigrants and refugees?
Oh my gosh, absolutely, absolutely. We can't have a homogeneous narratives. We have to have a variety of narratives. We grow in our locality, that we become universal at the same time. Instead of trying to be universal, we start with our locality of our particular story. And I might add this particular story, and that this, I know that you was told this is the last question, but I want to add this, is the power of learning and knowing our particularity is where strength is found. I'll give you an example. See, I traffic in stories. I love stories because of my parents. I love sharing stories. And one of my favorite stories is the birth of jazz music. The jazz that is born in New Orleans in the Congo Square as a result also of people of Haitian descent who made their way to New Orleans and still had the residue of freedom after fighting against the French. They come to New Orleans, and in this space on Sunday, known as the Congo Square, was the one time that Africans could operate in a free space and not have to work. And they would hear the sounds of the indigenous community, hear the sounds of those who were Spanish and French. And that's how jazz music was created. Very unique and uniquely American. But the powerful thing of the example of the question that you raised is that jazz is what's so beautiful about it, is that it takes what is not supposed to play together, plays together. So the saxophone was made for the marching band. That's what it was designed for. But the saxophone then plays with the piano, which comes out of this European classical setting. And then you have a trap drum set that is to be played in 1/2 time, but now is being played with polyrhythms that are influenced and come out of the pentatonic scale that comes out of the African tradition. And then you add the bass. The bass is supposed to be played with the bow, but he said, nope, I'm not going to use the bow, I'm going to use my fingers. And every instrument has the right to solo. In other words, the saxophone doesn't have to sound like the piano, and the piano doesn't have to sound like the bass, and the bass doesn't have to sound like the drums. Each one is able to solo out of their own cultural narrative and give their story. And jazz is teaching America democracy before America knew what democracy was all about, by saying that everybody has the right to solo. And I believe that our democracy should be a jazz democracy, not a symphony. Because a symphony demands a conductor to tell you what you need to do. But in a jazz band, everybody gets to gig and gets a chance to shine in the process. And so what we're called to do is to create the kind of democracy where everyone can bring their unique cultural narrative to the table and solo their story. And in the process of soloing your story, you end up informing the next musician who draws from that story and then brings their own story to the table. And that is what I believe what true democracy is. It is a jazz band working things out together in a beautiful way. Wow.
We ran out of time. I know there's many more questions, but I'll give you a secret. Get the book, Dancing in Darkness. All the answers are there to your questions. Dr. Moss will be next door. I hope all of you join us to enjoy the museum and this light of ours. Thank you, Dr. Moss. We are beyond grateful. I know that a lot of folks, myself included, are going to be in discussions in 2 weeks, 5 years from now, 10 years or 20. Were you in Cleveland, Ohio on January 16, 2023 at the Temple of Tifereth Israel and to hear Dr. Otis Moss III? It was incredible. We're forever grateful. Thank you all for coming today.